Truth Social post isn't the first time Donald Trump has spoken about Andy Burnham. He was asked about Andy Burnham, I think, a few weeks ago, and said he didn't know too much about the former mayor of Greater Manchester, but suggested he'd heard he was extremely liberal. And when I interviewed JD Vance a few weeks ago, I asked him about Andy Burnham, and he said he didn't know very much about him, but the Trump administration was keen to work with whoever the prime minister is as well as they could. The question is, what does as well as they could look like?
So Andy Burnham is starting today. He's already had his first Trump social media post. I guess the question, Katy, is perhaps you might explain what you think has happened. And then the question that follows is, does Trump really know what Andy Burnham's policy is? Does he not know, or is he deliberately trying to wind him up?
Well, it could be a combination of all these factors. Now, the Truth Social post isn't the first time Donald Trump has spoken about Andy Burnham. He was asked about Andy Burnham, I think, a few weeks ago, and said he didn't know too much about the former mayor of Greater Manchester, but suggested he'd heard he was extremely liberal. And when I interviewed JD Vance a few weeks ago, I asked him about Andy Burnham, and he said he didn't know very much about him, but the Trump administration was keen to work with whoever the prime minister is as well as they could. The question is, what does as well as they could look like? And I think with this Truth Social post, on the surface, you can think, oh, this is good news for Andy Burnham, because we know one of the big gripes the Trump administration has had with the Labour government under Keir Starmer has been the energy policy. It's why a story I reported with Steve Swinford, which was, US administration officials were actively warning Labour figures against the idea that Andy Burnham should appoint Ed Miliband as Chancellor. And that directly relates to the energy policy. The US see the net zero agenda, the lack of drilling in the North Sea, the no new licenses, as something that's holding the UK back across the board, and in their view, stopping the UK from being as strong and in their view, stopping the UK from being as strong an ally as it should be. They link it to things like defence funding, for example. So Trump taking to Truth Social and saying, Andy Burnham, brilliant, people in Scotland dancing on the streets because he's about to reverse this policy. It could be that Trump has got a little bit overexcited. I think that the general expectation is Andy Burnham is not going to go as far on oil and gas as the Trump Truth Social post has suggested, which means there could be some disappointment down the line.
And do you think he's doing this because he doesn't fully understand it, or he's trying to push him he thinks he can push him in a direction that he wants him to go in?
I think there's probably a sense, if you look at recent reports that the US would have picked up on, which is Andy Burnham is going to go further than perhaps Keir Starmer was. If Andy Burnham has been prevented from making Ed Miliband Chancellor, and we'll know that soon enough, is that a win for the US because they didn't want it to happen? So I think it's catching hold of something they think is already there. And if you are the president and you want to push it a bit further in your direction, there perhaps is a little bit of calculation to it. The truth is we just do not know what is in Donald Trump's mind when he writes these posts. But certainly, was Donald Trump meaning to be helpful when the day before Keir Starmer resigned, he took to Truth Social and said that, Keir Starmer was on the way out? And was that linked to anything he had heard, from the intelligence network, all those conversations with the UK?
Yeah.
Lots of people think some of these things are the case. These aren't completely separate. And I think what it does do is it just kind of put some pressure on Andy Burnham as to what his position would be, but it also just shows that you get some of these briefings from Labour figures, which is Andy Burnham is going to be different to Keir Starmer because he is going to spend less time on foreign affairs and he's going to be more domestically focused. And I think things like Truth Social on the eve of becoming Prime Minister are a reminder that it is actually just very hard in practice to say we're domestic, not international, particularly when it's Donald Trump who is in the White House.
That's such a good point, Katy. How do we think they'll get on? Because Burnham's in the paper today saying how relaxed he is about becoming Prime Minister. He's got a 10-year plan. He certainly doesn't lack in ego, Andy Burnham, I think it's fair to say. Donald Trump is possibly the great ego in world politics. Is Burnham going to rock up in his T-shirt and Manchester manner and get on with Trump? There's a kind of world in which they get on. There's a kind of world in which Burnham doesn't want to be seen to be butlerish to him like perhaps Starmer is. What do you make of? We don't know how they're going to go on. What do you think will happen?
Yeah, I think it could go in a few directions. And for example, you look at the New York mayor, Zohran Mamdani, and what Trump said during the election campaign, suggesting New York, his home city, would be ruined were Mamdani to get in. And then Mamdani has a meeting quite early on in the Oval Office, and it's a proper bromance. You know, Donald Trump is giving him compliments. Maybe this was slightly to unnerve some of Mamdani's supporters, but he actually struck up a bit of a bond with Mamdani because ultimately he thought that Mamdani was a winner and was inspiring his own movement, not one that Donald Trump has too much in common with. But even when Mamdani has endorsed candidates and, you know, those candidates have won in primaries, which is picking the candidates for the midterms in America, he said, you know, oh yeah, he's almost got a bit of me. So I think that if it's a leader that has some flair to them or personality, even if they are extremely liberal, there is a way where Donald Trump can just take a shine to them. That said, you know, we do know from the Zelensky incident in the Oval Office last year that the Trump administration appreciates a suit, not a T-shirt.
Yeah.
They did not go for that. And I think the question a little bit is how much does Andy Burnham and the team around him want to play into what is probably some quite low-hanging fruit in terms of taking digs at the Trump administration, which play well to the domestic audience and the Labour base and the party grassroots, and how much do they want to kind of find space to work with them? Because I think you can have personality and disagree with Trump on issues, but I think if it becomes almost a, you know, saying I disagree on X and almost leaning into it more than, you know, definitely more than Keir Starmer, but, you know, actively leaning into it. That's where I think you could, you know, start to come up with lots of criticism from the other side.
That's so interesting. And just finally, will anyone care in Washington who the foreign secretary is? I suspect the relationship is much more prime minister, isn't it? But I mean, it's not impossible. Ed Miliband could be the foreign secretary, which would be interesting in light of everything you've just said.
Yeah, I think if Ed Miliband is foreign secretary, it will be noticed in Washington, D.C. and by the Trump administration. Is something we reported a little bit on, but certainly Chancellor led to warnings. I think that foreign secretary is also a position that members, you know, like Trump officials have concerns if Ed Miliband were to take on the role. And that is because you look at Ed Miliband's past dealings with the Trump administration, and I think he's clashed with the US Ambassador Warren Stevens, or perhaps to put it more fairly, they had one meeting and they did not have a second meeting. And then I think if you look at some of Ed Miliband's positions, so for example, Marco Rubio is currently, having a campaign to question the legitimacy of the ICC, so the International Criminal Court. I think Ed Miliband in the past has spoken very positively about that. So I think if you have someone like Ed Miliband, it just sets them up much more on a collision course in terms of the stances they're likely to take than what you have with the current status quo. And I think the Trump administration would have been quite happy keeping Yvette Cooper in place. I don't think that sounds like it's going to happen, but certainly I think that who is foreign secretary in this instance could have an impact.
So interesting. Well, it's all to play for. We'll find out in the next few hours, won't we? Katy, great to speak to you as ever. Thanks so much.